an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Let's get ready to rumble!
All right, it's a Friday, so here we are on The Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Dave Trafford here from Story Studio Network. Keith Leslie joining us. You see and hear him on CHTV from time to time on The O Show with Laura Babcock in Hamilton, and John Wright from Maru Public Opinion. And week off at the legislature. They're taking care of business, I guess, for March break, and we kind of complained about that last week, Keith. But boy, a few things hitting the fan this week. So there's all kinds of stuff to talk about. So why don't we, can we start, though, with the carbon tax? Because that seems to have captured the political imagination, such as it is right across the country. We've got 7 premiers now, including Doug Ford here in Ontario, lining up against the Trudeau government, banging the desk and, you know, taking shoes off and doing whatever they're doing, banging the desk, all over a 23% carbon tax hike that is going to hit us all on April the 1st. Any tax hike that's 23%, I can see how people are saying, what the hell are we doing here? You're just driving the price up of everything, especially when you talk about fuel and gas, because that affects transportation costs, delivery costs, logistics, all that stuff, supply chain. So there's quite a wave here. And actually, after we got off the air last week on the podcast, and we were bitching, and I was saying how unlikable Pierre Poilievre is, I actually got a voicemail from him inviting me to the rally in Mississauga last weekend. So I guess we're good. I guess we're okay. He and I are on good terms. But clearly, that's the rhythm that we're going to see the Tories in Ottawa bang that drum right now until Election Day, that, you know, that carbon tax is going to kill the economy. It's going to kill us economically. It's not affordable. It's making it harder for people to, you know, get to the point where they can make ends meet. And the Prime Minister saying this week it's not his job to be popular. Well, clearly he's doing well at that one.
Absolutely. I mean, he seems to be sticking to his guns here. Defending the carbon tax all the way along. And this 23% increase sounds so ominous. And it gives Pierre Poilievre in particular in his Axe the Tax campaign. I mean, who does want to face a 23% tax? That just sounds crazy. But it's a 23% on the current carbon tax, right? Which we worked out on gasoline is something like 14.2 cents a liter. Yeah. So a 23% increase on that is going to be, I think John did the math for us, 3.2 cents a liter. Well, gasoline goes up and down more than 3.2 cents a liter.
Yeah, and I got the 14.3 cents from the Ontario.ca website. So they're all playing with the same number here. But to your point, yeah, I mean, that's 3 cents on, you know, that liter of gas. And again, I don't want to diminish the cost of living and how, you know, difficult it is, John, for people to, you know, make ends meet. But 3 cents, I mean, I see that kind of fluctuation, maybe 5 or 6 cents some days at the gas pumps for no obvious reason. So I have no idea how much, you know, of that is baked in as far as the carbon tax is concerned. And at the end of the day, I'm getting my rebate check, 1. 2, the cost of gasoline has not stopped me from driving my car.
Yeah, I think also to put it in dollars and cents terms, if you put in 32 liters at the gas station, that's $1 extra. So there you go. That kind of puts it in perspective. I think you're right. It has lined up, I think it's now 7 premiers who are talking about this. They're very proactive on it. Doug Ford has been very proactive on it. We have a budget coming up. We have whether or not the province is going to extend its tax holiday on gas as well. So affordability is a huge issue in this country. I think if you stack it up against almost every issue that you can have going on the polling, you're going to find that it ranks at the top of the list. It's given Pierre Poilievre an enormous platform to deal with, but it's also given him an enormous runway because you can see when it's coming. You know when it's coming, and you can yell about it and scream about it. So Axe the Tax that everybody knows the slogan about, is front and center. I don't know personally, and it would be great to have somebody who's expert in government finances to come on, how much of that ends up in general revenues, and whether or not it's paying down trying to put towards the $46 billion deficit that we're going to have this year. That's what the parliamentary budget officer says Canada is going to be carrying. And we're already at $1 trillion. We're paying more in interest payments nowadays than we are for healthcare. That's the bottom line. So I don't know where this all goes, because I'm not really sure that I see the impact on the environment or in terms of green products or anything else. I personally don't see it. I don't think other people do. So trying to make the point that you're the prime minister and you have to make tough decisions and you can be unpopular and that's the legacy that you have, it'll all work out in the future, is kind of the Brian Mulroney thing nowadays, right? Like he left government when he was at, I think, 18% in the polls. I think his popularity got down to 9%. And yet when he passes on, state funeral, everybody's got glowing remarks about, and rightly so. Okay. But it doesn't help the now, and it certainly doesn't help those Canadians who are suffering. And this is a perfect platform for them, for politicians and others to go at the government for.
See, the difference, though, I think, Keith, if we want to compare the Mulroney approach, the GST was something necessary to stabilize the income for the government and revenues and everything else, and it turned out to be the right thing to do. The carbon tax, on the other hand, is way more complicated because, we've reduced it to the price of the gas pumps. But let's face it, you have to heat your homes. There's all kinds of costs that's involved with larger industries, whether it's farming or forestry or some of these, mining. We were just at the mining event, and the cost of actually running these things with fossil fuel is part of that cost of doing business and so on. So it's more complicated than just filling up the tank at the gas pump. But, that's the eye level part of it. Two things. John talks about where is that money going to go. We hear the prime minister say, well, that's supposed to incentivize businesses to be greener because there's a cost attached to it. Okay. But the other side of it is, as I said, I'm getting that rebate check. So I don't understand the economics here, because we already know that the public service, since COVID, has just exploded in terms of numbers of jobs, more so than anything else in the private sector. So the administrative costs to this are extraordinary.
Well, that's why cap and trade, which the Ford government canceled, which is why Ontario is now subject to the carbon tax, made much more sense, because it taxed the polluters at a higher rate. It didn't come at the ground level here, at the everyday consumer level. It was the polluters themselves that were capped, and they could bargain their trades. They could trade these caps. There was an actual market there. Ontario was in it with California. It was a growing market. Now we're subject to the carbon tax. Back to Mulroney and the GST, just for a point. Remember, the GST had a huge benefit for manufacturers. It replaced the manufacturer's tax, which had made Canada very uncompetitive. It was tough. That was a tough decision, because it was consumers that were going to pick up and pay this GST on everything, which we hadn't been taxed on everything before at the retail level. So it was quite a push, and it was a different one, but there was a clear strategy there to help manufacturers to get the economy back on the track that it needed to get on. With the carbon tax, we're going for a lofty goal. Someone call it a woke goal, but we have to do something to rein in our emissions. Taxing everyday people at the pumps and at their electricity bill, just everywhere you turn around. And then saying, well, but we're sending you checks. I'm going to tax you at one hand, and then I'm going to send you a check at another. Any government that does that has to know that in the middle of that is this massive bureaucracy, administrative costs. So how much of this actual carbon tax that's administered at this level is actually getting to dealing with the carbon problem, and how much is actually just paying for the bureaucracy to get us to issue those checks? What government doesn't like to issue checks to people? So here you got a government taxing you on one hand and sending you checks with the other. And I think for most people, and to John's point, is this really going to help address the carbon problem? Or is it just a bureaucracy? Is it another showpiece? Is it just another Trudeau woke showpiece with a lofty goal, but that we're never going to achieve it? And of course, there's also the other argument that many, many Canadians have and feel strongly about, that we're such a small player, despite being a big country. Our pollution levels are just so minuscule compared with China, India, and other major countries.
Yeah, but that's a bullshit argument. I'm sorry. That's just, we've got the opportunity here to do what we should be doing in our neighborhood and take control of it. Having said that, the problem with all of this, John, is that the everything. He's only got one tool, and everything's he's only got one hammer and everything's a nail in this case, as opposed to saying there has to be a strategy and a broader vision in terms of how we are going to mitigate climate change. How are we going to reduce carbon in the atmosphere? And there are all kinds of ways of doing that. There are small communities, New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. Right now, they're looking at a project of installing district heating in that town, about 10,000 people. Okay, so what happens is they have a plant that's going to generate heat based on biofuels that they're burning wood product, the leftover wood you can't use for anything else, pretty much. And there's a network of pipes, kind of like the pipes that deliver gas to your house in a major urban center. It's just going to be water. They heat the water. The hot water actually heats your house. And when you turn the tap on, you get the hot water right from the source. So you don't have a furnace and you don't have a hot water heater. You don't have the cost of running both of those things. It's run like a utility. So, just like you would pay for your garbage pickup or whatever else, you're paying a flat rate right across the community for the cost of that. The estimates are that will save this town 28% in heating costs alone. And it significantly reduces the carbon emissions based on what otherwise you would put out for the heating of that community. That's one small town in Nova Scotia that's got that kind of thinking. Where the hell is the vision nationally on this kind of stuff? There's all kinds of technology out there. And if you were able to come to me and say, John, we're going to save you almost 30% on your heating costs every year, I'm in.
Yeah. So let's step back for a moment. I mean, number one, the only way in which to exact change in society is oftentimes to put the price up so you become more efficient, if that's the goal. So, the higher the cost, the more innovative you're going to get to try and keep the cost low. You may hate the politicians for doing what they're doing, or you may hate the supplier for it, but that's the point. So this is meant in many ways is to drive efficiencies and ingenuity and all that sort of stuff. To your point, Dave, that's exactly what, happens there. Number two, my son is a carpenter. He got out of the chef business after 10 years because he was tired of being in 33 Celsius degree kitchens and being yelled at when in fact everybody was coming for his food. And he became a carpenter, and he just bought one of those huge trucks. I don't even know the make of it, but it's absolutely monster where you got to get a ladder to get into the front of the car. And it's got, all the gate, is the looks like the back end of a bus. It's so long. And so he puts all his tools in there. And he was telling me the other night, I said, holy Jesus, for the amount of gas you're going to put in that, because he's driving from Newmarket to Mississauga to do the work overnight because they've got contracts that have to be done in a store. And he said, yeah, but the other thing, Dad, is that at a certain speed, this just clicks into a 4-cylinder car. So you got this monster truck and it's not doing 8 cylinders like we would have had in the old days. He says, my fuel savings are massive because it automatically goes into that. We have hybrid cars that automatically click into this. So you can't tell me that with the cost of the carbon tax and everything else, that this ingenuity wouldn't have been happening. So, it's a trickle-down effect. The third point I would make, though, is it's a crowded agenda for what people need nowadays. We're going to talk a little bit about that, the seniors issue that's ahead of us. And I'm Dave and Keith, that since 2012, I've been banging this drum. And I can't seem to get a band together. I'm kind of like Ringo Starr in the background without the 3 front guys. But this is incredibly predictable, and it's going to be very costly. And the implications on our housing structure alone in our cities, because 85% of elderly people say that they want to live in place, whatever that means. They want to just live in their homes or long-term care, whatever. And then you get into the Ontario government. The other discussion that came up this past week was, a home is a bed. My God. And they're handing out checks to municipalities who are counting those extra beds as homes so that they can get the extra money. I go down the rabbit hole because this is just one of those items on the list. And you rightly said at the outset, Dave, this could be a growing catastrophe for the world, and particularly for communities across the country. We've already seen high level flooding. We see, forest fires, which are going to be the worst this year on record. And yet we're talking about the carbon tax. We're talking about the affordability of all. We're talking about issues that when you rank them, climate change it may be notionally the highest issue, but on the ground, it's not. It's about how I can live from paycheck to paycheck and day to day nowadays. So it's got a hell of a lot of competition to try and solve something that you really, really can't. It's not a blue box that you can take out to the sidewalk and say, look what I've done. This is what I've accomplished. So I come back to this crowded agenda. Innovation is only driven at the ground and in other places. And the only other way that seems to be the way to do this is not just to incentivize people, but to penalize them so it incentivizes them to come up with the ideas.
Sure, but there has to be a 360 approach to this. Right now, we're only going 180 right down the line, Keith. We're only looking one direction here, as opposed to saying this is part of it, but you know the polluters are still going to pay more. You're going to do your part by doing this. This is where it's going to come from. But that's only nibbling around the edges all the time. So, I think the challenge is that governments, and it doesn't matter, it's not the feds, because the provinces are all playing the same game from the other side of the court, is that they're looking at this from a singular point of view, one, but the problem is that they're not able to connect the dot between this is costing people real money for something they really need. You can't do without heating in this country in the middle of fucking winter. So I have to heat the house. It's not like I have a choice. So that's where the disconnect is, and that's where the anger comes from.
It's as you say, the utilities, we can't live without them. And yet we're trying to design things. I just heard something the other day. Someone I know lives, they call them mini homes, right? They used to be called mobile homes, but they're called mini homes now. And she told me she has to heat it because of the furnace they put into these mini homes with stove oil. Mm-hmm. Which is apparently about 50% more than home heating oil.
And it's dirtier.
These are the new homes. We're trying to get people to go into these smaller homes. These are starter homes for many, many families, young families. And they have to spend 50% more just to heat the damn. This is not the way we're going. We're going in the wrong direction completely on this. As you say, if we're going to open up a community of small mini homes, whatever you want to call them, why can't we have district heating there? Mm-hmm. A small little heat plant, just boom, boom. All these, there's no major connect other than we keep paying more. The pollution keeps getting worse. The predictions are all dire. There's no, even after Ontario took, let's face it, what was a huge, huge step to shut down all its coal generating electricity. Yep. Massive step. That really was a game changer. But Ontario, that was like 2007. Ontario is still using that era, that accomplishment for its carbon. This is all the carbon we've cut. They're going back to that. Nothing has changed since then, really. So other than we're bringing more nuclear power and more gas power onto the line, but we're not in any way addressing how we get the innovation, the type John was talking about, where your 8-cylinder big diesel truck turns into a 4-cylinder car almost, just because it doesn't need all that power. There's got to be other ways for us to heat our homes more efficiently, to power our vehicles, all of this. But we don't see any, as you say, government program just connecting the dots for us at all. And just the one point about where they were counting long-term care beds as homes. Premier Ford this week said he was asked about, the judges and all that. And he talked about, like, I'm going to build as many jails as necessary. If they're overcrowded, now I'm going to build as many jails. They build jails the same way they do long-term care homes. They count them as beds. How many jail beds? Are they going to be counted as homes?
Yeah. Well, just to close the loop on this, the carbon tax. I just did an interview with a guy who was in Mahone Bay in Nova Scotia, and his name is Jamie Stephen, and it's part of a series we're doing with the Forestry for the Future, and it's the show is called Canadian Forestry Can Save the World, so it's a little ambitious. But the idea behind all of this and where the technology is, we dug into a lot of the conversations around the innovation and how you can mitigate and reduce emissions. And Jamie Stephen will tell you that if you use carbon capture properly, storage systems, particularly that's driven by biofuel, you can not only reduce the emissions, you can actually have negative emissions. That is to say, net, you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Jamie can explain it way better than I can. So I would encourage you to dip into our podcast called Canadian Forestry Can Save the World. And the episode with Jamie Stephen, I think, is coming out next week. So a week this coming Tuesday. And it makes your head spin. He is so provocative, but when you listen to what he's got to say, he actually challenges the government to say, where the hell are you people on this? We don't have the time to screw around, and we've got the technology. And I'll tell you, without giving away the twist in the story, the best place on the planet for carbon capture storage, bioenergy carbon capture storage, is Alberta. Alberta. And it's
why could I see that coming?
Right? But here we are. So the center of the universe for the oil patch in this part of our world is the best place in the world to capture carbon and help not only reduce but create negative emissions and help us transition away from fossil fuel. Why the government of Alberta is not banging that drum right now, I have no idea. But anyway, I would encourage you to go and check out that website. All right, let's turn to the long-term care stuff, because there's a few things, and to your point, the idea that the ridiculous notion that a long-term care bed is somehow a home is absurd. But Keith, the problems are greater than that, because there's this class action lawsuit now that's been launched against the actual operators of the long-term care homes. I don't know how. I mean, I expect at some point this does splash on Queen's Park, but it's a huge tangled mess.
Oh, absolutely. This is 6 of the largest long-term care home providers in Ontario. The judge has approved. Now, remember, at the beginning of COVID in 2020, the Ford government passed legislation that exempted long-term care homes from lawsuits as long as they were making a good faith effort to deal with this unprecedented pandemic. But there was, of course, an exception for basically not doing your job. And that's what happened here. The horror stories of 4,000 plus seniors dying, some of them, as we heard, in their own filth, when the Canadian Forces had to go in and pick up these homes and try and deal with the mess that was created. The outcomes from the private nursing homes versus the public ones. The pandemic was way more, it hurt many more patients in the privately run homes. The death rate was mortality higher in the private run home. And so that's why I think the judge has approved this class action suit. What's it going to mean, though? I mean, the government is going around, as you say, counting new long-term care, and it's announcing lots of homes for long-term care beds that it's building, and it's counting each one as a home towards its housing goal. That strategy seems just nonsensical, I think, to most Ontarians. They just don't believe this. But most up in a long-term care home, as John said, the polling shows 85% of us want to stay at home as long as we possibly can. And that's, we're going to need more home care. And that, as well, is a part of this whole long-term care, home care strategy that this government is just seemingly, they're not coordinating this at all. Then the home care seems to have gotten worse and worse. I'm old enough to remember a time when the Victorian Order of Nurses, the VON, and we all knew someone post-surgery, the VON visited, but then I think it was the Liberals in Ontario opened it up to competition, and the privates came in and basically pushed out a lot of these former nonprofit service providers for home and community care. So we've gone backwards in some ways in this situation, and it's now very costly. And we're not, what was the statistics? Something like 375,000 more Ontarians are going to be over the age in the next 5 years. Wow. And we've already got tens of thousands of people without access to a primary care physician. How is this? How do we square this? We've definitely got to put more into home care. But I mean, the government, it seems to be, looking at nibbling again around the edges. We need some major strategy on home care so that when you come out of a hospital, or to avoid going into a hospital, you're getting the treatment you need. And a lot of it was, again, when I remember after the changes, when the VON were basically pushed out, a lot of people who had these service providers, they had a relationship with them. Now, all of a sudden, you're getting 4 people in a week coming, different people every time. It's not, everyone's on the clock. They're pushed. And these people they're good workers. They're trying to do their best. But the scheduling they're put in, it's ridiculous. They're really, And the fact, and if you have someone helping you with such personal care needs, and the next day it's somebody else, and then the next day it's someone else, that's not the system. People aren't going to want to tolerate that. It's almost inhumane. So we need a much better coordinated system, but it has to, the home care has almost been left out, it seems. And we're watching this government nibble around the edges of the overall healthcare, really getting us any more doctors or nurses. They say they've hired tens of thousands more nurses. Really? Well, where are they? Why are we so short of nurses? Why are we so short of nurses? We can't open hospital beds. It's because they've left the profession, a lot of them. So this government is talking a great game about doing so much with these nurses and doctors and more medical school spaces. But we're seeing the opposite. And the reality is fewer and fewer people have access to a physician. Why is that? This government, its programs are not coordinated enough to get us all the care we need from home and into the long-term care all the way.
Well, I think there's two things there, John, or maybe three. First is that this is more about primary care. First of all, is that there's a dire shortage of general practitioners, and that's where primary care really comes into play. The second thing is that the whole idea that folks want to age in place, the implication is, if you go with the long-term care system, is that every one of us is going to go from being reasonably healthy to needing round-the-clock care and just weeks shy of palliative care. I mean, that's kind of, I'm exaggerating, but that's sort of the model that's in place. There's no in-between there. And to Keith's point, that's where the home care falls apart. But that's where primary care is really critical. So, yes, it's easy to point the guns at Queen's Park and our non-existent, Groundhog Day health minister. Where the hell is she? Oh, look, she just popped up out of the hole. But this is a federal vision we need. We need standards right across the country to be able to say this is going to happen. Because say what you will about what's gone on here in Ontario. Remember, don't forget what happened in Quebec. I mean, holy shit, that was just beyond tragic. That was criminal. I mean, I use that in the small lowercase letters, but you get my point. So that the healthcare system in and of itself, first we need primary care, and second is long-term care needs to be part of the health ministry. Start there.
Well, let's unpack a few things there. I think the question that's used in most public opinion polls on aging in place, which was used this week as an example in another poll, is actually it's not appropriate. I mean, it doesn't unpack it the way in which you think. And the reality is that we do want to live in place, but there are various stages in our life that we go through. So living in a house in downtown Toronto is living in place today, but also as you downsize and go along the way, you are wanting to live in place, but you're not occupying the same place that you live in today. Like it is a gradual thing. What you're really asking people is, when do you want to go and be in a long-term care home or in a senior citizens retirement community, which is even aging in place? But it's when you're not able to age in the place to which you choose. Okay, because the last thing we want to do is have the government saying, "Look, you got to get out of that hospital bed, and we're going to ship you to Temiskaming because, you can't take up that space." So that in a way is you have to unpack the question. Number two, this may be the place for standards across the country imposed by the federal government. I don't think so, because it's provincial jurisdiction. I don't think that we're going to get agreement on that with the healthcare ministers. I don't know how much of a fiat you can put in place for all of this, but it comes down to the individual provinces and how they're going to deal with this. Thirdly, you talk about vision. I totally agree with you, but we've just talked about the demand for the environment and the destruction versus now another piece, which also is going to demand a huge amount of money and a huge amount of effort. Again, we're talking about Ontario here. What confounds me is that when you get into power as a government with a huge majority, and you have the power and the resources to deal with big issues, this government tends to deal with retail issues. It's not approaching this, to bring together the round table for a long-term vision. And if they are doing it behind the scenes, it should be out front. But they're not activating legacy pieces to deal with the tough things. We're dealing with buck of beer and liquor in the corner store and license plates and all that sort of stuff. This is going to be, for me, 9 years away, a major crisis. It's going to be huge, and it is predictable. So bringing in technology and innovation, going back to the whole issue of what you talked about with the imposition of the carbon tax and driving municipalities to come up with innovation, there are technological innovations we're going to have to come up with, because we can't be all going to see our doctor. We can't be made to be going in to see doctors. We can't be made to see doctors that don't exist. We can't be made to be going into emergency wards because of ailments that could be taken care of elsewhere. And I just fear that the federal government can talk all it wants, but at the end of the day, it's the provinces. And my fear is that the province of Ontario and others just are not prepared at all for this. You think things are bad now with 2.5 million people in this province not having access to a doctor. You just wait when that percentage actually retires. You know, it's incredible that those doctors themselves are going to retire, you know, and you have nothing to replace them with. So I think that it's now that you've got to be on the front lines, putting together not only a vision, but where you're going to be putting the trenches in, where you're going to be moving your troops. And I don't see it happening, and it's a catastrophe waiting to happen.
Well, I use the phrase criminal as far as what happened in Quebec and the long-term care. Keith, the willful ignorance at all levels of government. Let's cut the slack for the municipalities because they really don't have any skin in this game specifically. But the provinces and the feds, this is willful ignorance on all counts when we talk about that level of care, whether it's primary care or long-term care.
Oh, and 10 years from now, we'll be saying, why didn't anyone, didn't they see
Didn't we see this coming?
Demographics? Didn't we? The demographics were clear. Same with whenever we run into the teacher shortage. The demographics are always clear. Governments are just short-term thinkers. And it's hard for them to worry about something 10 years down the road. And when we see, trying to do something like a carbon tax, it comes back to haunt them when you're looking at long-term strategies like that. So I guess governments, you're right. I mean, they just, especially the federal and provincial governments, they're just dropping the ball on this. One thing, I mean, we're talking about the doctor shortage and the loss of primary care physicians. I want to just touch briefly on, we've talked before about Shoppers Drug Mart and their med checks. Yeah. They can phone someone. If you've had 3 or more prescriptions, they'll phone you. And it's usually it used to be at the pharmacist's discretion. If you thought maybe, Mrs. Hunt wasn't taking the medications correctly, or you wanted to make sure they were doing okay with her, the pharmacist would make that decision and call them, and the provision for them to be paid, the pharmacist to be paid $75 for that call. But we hear Shoppers is, of course, setting targets for call everybody that has 3 prescriptions or more. And again, $75 a call added up to $1.4 million billed to Ontario taxpayers for 1 week last month. 1 week, Shoppers doing these med checks. Now, I'm tying this back into the doctors. The doctors, if you've got 3 or more prescriptions, they've all been handed to you by your doctor if you're lucky enough to have one. He, of course, is going to check to make sure you know that you're taking them correctly and monitor you and call you, if you need to have them adjusted. He gets paid $38 a visit. If we can pay Shoppers $75 for doing the phone call, can't we pay the doctors at least? That's more than double. I bet you that'd go a long way to retaining some doctors who, by the way, doctors are also private healthcare providers. They're just able to build the OHIP system. So that little point alone, that we're paying Shoppers $1.4 million in 1 week last month, $1.4 million. How far would that go towards doctors and nurses? Just that little bit. Forget about all the other privatization stuff. Just that. That right there tells me we're not thinking smart. We're losing primary care physicians all over the place. We're letting nurse practitioners open clinics, and they can't bill OHIP, so they're billing you directly. And the government's doing nothing about any of this except making sure Shoppers and Galen Weston get their big slice of our healthcare dollar.
Well, and you're back to your point around the need for relationship in the healthcare system. I mean, that in and of itself has a restorative, the recuperative effect when you can have eye contact and have an emotional contact with somebody who knows what circumstance that you're living with. To have the pharmacy pick up the phone because it's an auto call for all intents and purposes. I don't know anything about you, Keith. I just see here that you need to have your prescription renewed, as opposed to Dr. John Wright being able to call and say, how you doing, John? I haven't seen you in a while, Keith. Everything okay? There's just even the tone of the conversation makes a difference.
But for them to set targets.
Yeah.
There was one report Shoppers is offering the pharmacists optimum points to make these calls. Jesus Christ. Where are we going with this? If we can offer those kind of incentives, can't we get the public sector working with that kind of incentive? Can't we put the money there where we're supposed to have it?
Well, if you look at Shoppers, I think in reading the CBC article that went into great detail on this, I think Shoppers was making $1.8 million a week on it, which is, when you add it all up, is over $100 million, right? We and that is Loblaws, and Loblaws is killing it with all of their profits. And, they're not part of a consortium that I'm seeing that brings together like-minded parties, not necessarily on the on making profit, but part of a solution to try and integrate and to coordinate this. I bring up a friend of mine has a company in the United States. I don't have any financial stake in it currently. I wish I did. That has invented a box that connects to your television. It's called Cortex. And what it allows you to do is to have I think the innovation is not so much the Android platform that allows you to put AI on it. Like some of the stuff I see that they're putting on these things is actually, if you get an integrated camera on your television or something that fits above it and you show your face on it, the AI will actually read how you're doing on about 32 different dimensions. It can take your blood pressure, it can take your pulse rate, you can feed it all back. I mean, the technological aspects of this even go down to UHN, where we have in the rehab hospital is a technology area called CITE. And they have been working on now the last number of years where they have got garments. They got a $30 million worth of funding for this stuff to produce garments that have filaments in it that if you wear it, it will transmit all of the vitals into a web-based solution that go and it's monitored and looked at. I mean, we have all of this, but it's not being pulled together. The only solution for these things is not trying to make more doctors to see more elderly people, but trying to innovate on the technology, which allows you to have other different layers. I don't need a doctor to come in and check on me in home care, but Cortex, which is actually the usable and most remarkable thing about it, is the clicker. We still call it that, the clicker, which allows you to kind of push a button and get into the system and do it very easily. You can even order groceries from Longo's or things from Walmart or whatever at the same time. But it's very, very simple for seniors. What it allows you to do is to have nurse practitioners or certified public sector workers or others in the system who can do that job. You don't, and then escalate it if it's necessary. Hell no. I've even got an Apple Watch on right now that I think the door slammed because of the wind the other day. And it jolted me a bit, and it came up on my watch. I see you've had a fall. Do you need assistance? For God's sake, we've got all of these pieces, and that's the only way we're going to go forward. So I ask this publicly because I don't know whether it's the case. Where is the task force for the province of Ontario to integrate all of this technology and all of these things into the home care issue? Because it's going to come at us. It is coming at us down the track like a locomotive, and it's predictable. And I sure as hell want to be on the safe side of the technology division between government and industry to come up with these solutions, because I don't want to be left in the middle of the track 9 years from now. And that's kind of where I'm going. So I think that the solution to this, a lot of it is not necessarily people, but the redistribution of technology so you can use less people to do more.
Well, sadly, we've flipped that around. We do more with less, and that seems to be the order of the day.
I just want to point people now, if you can't get a primary care physician, they'll often refer you to go to Maple online, and you'll get a primary care nurse and stuff. That's owned by Loblaws too, and they wanted $50 for my first connect, which I wouldn't pay or connect. Another Loblaw way into the healthcare system. I mean, they're just there, and it's it's not helpful. And that's not a good use of the technology at all. What John's talking about would be a good use.
Well,
of
and again, it's easy to shit on the private industry, and I realize that their first inclination is to make money, and I'm not going to argue with that. But the problem is that we have no guardrails around it, or we do not seem to have any strategy. We do not seem to have the task force that says here's the best way to integrate and be efficient, and all the things that John's talked about. So that falls right on the Premier's desk. It falls on the Prime Minister's desk. Start and stop right there. We want that private sector innovation and incentives to do better and all that stuff. And I don't have a problem paying the pharmacist $75 if at the end of the day we're actually having better healthcare outcomes, not better bottom line for the stakeholders at Shoppers or at Loblaw. I mean, that's the problem with it. That seems to be the focus.
But isn't it up to we've been around politics a long time. Collectively, if you took all of our experience and put it together, you've got like 130 years worth of watching governments and stuff like that, right? Okay, outside of the logistics of trying to coordinate this and having what looked like the old 1980s constitutional roundtables with premiers to try and get something done on home care and health care and all that sort of stuff, it does start in the premier's office. It starts at the top. And it begins with even people around the premier who say, what do you want this legacy to be about? Because the legacy we have here right now is, it reminds me of the Gomery Commission, right? Small town stuff. It's all small town stuff and walkbacks. That's what you see. Even the Superior Court in Ontario said, hey, look at all these long-term care homes. Yes, you can sue them. We got a class action suit now against all of them. Nothing protected them from that. We got $6 billion we have to pay in back wages on other things. We've got land transfers that are being walked back. We now have got into the absurdity that lying in a bed constitutes the same value as a dwelling. Like, just come on, folks. If you want to do it right, maybe this. I don't assume anymore that there are actually people sitting in rooms trying to come up with solutions with stakeholders on this stuff. You and I and all of us have seen this enough that you kind of assume government's doing this when they're not doing it. Like, they're just not. So where is this? It is going to be the most incredibly difficult time of our life. And I will argue this and say it will also be over quickly. By 2041, when we're not around to do this podcast, well, maybe you will, Keith. The reality is that all of a sudden we'll wake up. Some people will wake up. It certainly won't be me. We'll wake up one morning, our children, and go, where did they all go? They're gone. And all of a sudden you're going to end up with these long-term care homes that'll have to be converted into shopping malls because they won't be there. So we're dealing with a very compressed time frame here that is just going to come whooshing through the system, and then it'll be gone. But the destructive path it has, everybody, I swear you right now, by 2030, so 6 years from now, if we're still doing this podcast from our crank beds, we will be talking about the crisis unfolding that nobody did anything about even 6 years before. And it's just so unfortunate because I'll go full circle. Is that the legacy you want to leave? Or is the legacy you want to leave saying he actually started to do something about it that was going to be a catastrophe, averted it by bringing in technology and innovation and things like that, and spent the time doing things that were big issues as opposed to the little shit about going into stores and getting a beer? I don't begrudge the corner stores folks. If that's what they want to do, that's fine. But it's a matter of priority and agenda for governments to set. And if you want to do one, you should be actually focusing as well on the other stuff. And that it just doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, well, juggling eggs is basically what we're doing here. And
one's an ostrich egg.
Nobody wants to
one's
throw
an
one
ostrich egg, and one's a chicken egg. For God's sake,
for sure.
Egg,
but when you drop them, John, they're fucked.
Oh
so,
yeah, well,
you got one shot.
Add a little milk.
So here we go. This weekend we're heading for St. Patrick's Day. So for those of you who are celebrating, enjoy that. And I'm just going to close by telling you, last weekend I had the chance to go to the Rose Theatre in Brampton. What a beautiful facility. I've never been there before. And it was a Christmas gift I got from my mom. And it was a concert. I just thought, we got enough stuff in our life. Let's have an experience. So I bought her tickets to this show at the Rose Theatre in Brampton. And I gave her a ticket and 5 others, and there's John's got the derby on the green. That's all. He's all set. And so I said, here's a ticket for you and 5 other tickets. You can take whoever you want. But I happen to know that my wife and I, my brother and sister-in-law, and my uncle are all available on that date. So if you want us all to come, we'll come. So she was gracious enough to invite us all, and off we go. And the band is called Cherish the Ladies. I knew nothing about this group before I showed up, except the blurb in the ad. And the reason I did it is because it was an Irish Celtic concert, St. Patrick's Day, etc. And man, it was so cool on a number of levels. First, get out and see what was going on, and we can talk maybe next week about the challenges that we're having with festivals across the province, across the country, and what that means to the economy. But the importance of experiencing that kind of thing was really cool. But I discovered a song that they played, and it's called Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears. And it's about Ellis Island. And it's an extraordinary song. And what it did was it made me realize all of a sudden that my 21st century privilege was born out of the desperation of, getting away from 19th century deprivation in Ireland. And and then the resilience and the courage it took for the immigrants and the refugees, whether they were from Ireland or anywhere else, to come to a country that was brand new, leave their home, leave their families behind. And let's face it, nobody does better in terms of raising the emotions than the Celts do when it comes to lyric and the combination of lyric and melody. This is one of those songs. So anyway, it was just a fascinating thing. We feature that song on this week's edition of Now and Next. So if you want to have a listen to it, it's really kind of a cool piece. And for those of you celebrating, yes, the green beer and the green hats are all part of it. But it made me think about, we all have an immigrant story, an immigration story, for the most part, for those of you listening. So maybe you want to reflect on that this weekend for Thanksgiving. For St. Patrick's Day. Maybe it should be Thanksgiving in that respect, because we've got a lot that we can be
potatoes.
Grateful for. But with potatoes and green beer and all that thing. So all good. Listen, guys, have a great weekend.
You too. Take care.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.